Wonder Woman. Feminist icon, one of DC's leading trinity of heroes, one of the most famous heroes in comic book history that continues to be an advocate for female empowerment, equality, and all the other good stuff in the world. People like to think of her character as constantly being this testament to female power, as being this figure that's fought against the male-dominated grain of the industry, with a rich history of amazing stories of putting the women first and avoiding all the tropes and traps set by writers to contain women to lesser roles in this fantastical genre. Except, when you look deeper into Wonder Woman's over 80-year history, there are a lot of instances and story arcs where she hasn't exactly been this champion of peace and feminism or a breaker of gender stereotypes in hero stories. I'm going to take you through some of the weirder moments of Diana Prince's history that potentially drag her feminist icon status through the mud. Wonder Woman's been a member of countless teams throughout DC, including the very first, the Justice Society of America. Well, not quite. In All-Star Comics number 12, rather than placing her in the thick of the fight, the squad chose to keep her as their secretary and made her only an honorary member. This honour, as she even calls it, to remain out of the fight and take care of state matters back home, like many women were doing during the war, despite the fact she literally spent the last issue fighting off an entire Japanese battalion of soldiers by herself. She still made an appearance and fought in 47 of the original 74 issue run, so at least she had her moment to shine in the boys' club before they pushed her to the side. Speaking of Wonder Woman's early days, her very third issue is wrought with questionable ideals and practices about the female gender. Now at this point we're all aware and try to ignore the strong BDSM tones present in early Wonder Woman stories, as creator William Marston's personal interest in such matters often found its way onto the pages of Diana Prince's early comics. However, these themes are hard to ignore when, for a good few pages of this issue, it reads like a pervert's buffet selection, as we watch with incredible detail a unique Amazonian ritual, where Amazons are dressed like deer, are hunted by the remaining Amazons, get strung up and skinned by removing their deer costume, and then get tied up and placed on a dinner table where the hunters pretend to eat them. There's a very clear tone about the whole thing, and I don't think I have to elaborate on why this can be seen as repressive of women and a terrible moment in which a comic is caught promoting questionable ideals and practices in a younger audience by having them be revered by a bright, costumed and likeable heroic character. Not through there, because Wonder Woman continues this promotion of oppression later in this issue. In this issue, we are introduced to one of Diana's less iconic but no less important foes, Paula von Gunther, aka the Baroness, the first reoccurring supervillainess in comic book history. First appearance, she leads a Nazi spy ring in which she brainwashes several female government employees to work for her. In the end, Wonder Woman frees the girls and put an end to the Baroness's scheme, and it seems like the perfect place to end the story, but it doesn't. When one of the girls tells Diana how horrifying it was to be under someone else's control, Wonder Woman says this. In retrospect, Wonder Woman advocating for the slavery of women is laughable, especially because of how genuinely progressive Wonder Woman was at the time, often trying to solve problems without violence and rehabilitate her enemies. So this really made no sense. Coupled with the strange cannibal BDSM fest from earlier in the issue, this comic did no favours for Diana as the supposed staple for female empowerment. As with many stories told in the 60s, the so-called Silver Age of comics, Wonder Woman fell victim to a lot of ludicrous forced romance plots that placed her as the love interest in her own comic series, vulnerable to the thralls of men. In the aptly named issue 125, Wonder Woman Battle Prize, we witness Steve Trevor, Wonder Woman's longtime romantic interest, doing battle with the Merman for Diana's affections, but they end up having to work together to save her from aliens. It's another silly story emblematic of the period, much like issue 155, I Married a Monster, where Diana falls in love with the Monster Prince after he impresses her with her might and passion, as she sees him for more than the monster he appears as. In what could be perceived as a commentary on how society perceives behaviour, the monster turns handsome when he acts good and appears as a green monster when he's bad. Though despite moments where he isn't actually being bad, he still appears as a monster for all but 2 panels of his appearance. He eventually decides to break it off, leaving Diana at the altar as he doesn't want Diana to sacrifice her happiness for him. But after a near-death experience, he realises how happy he was before he met women and decides he wants to be left alone, much to the teary-eyed and still pining Wonder Woman's dismay. In both of these stories, Wonder Woman has been reduced from the strong, independent champion of peace we know her to be, and instead becomes, as issue 125 put, a romantic prize, succumbing to the whims and wills of the men around her. To her credit, in issue 155, Wonder Woman spends a majority of the issue fighting off her suitors as they try and force themselves upon her, and then saving them when they're too helpless to do so themselves. And as stated before, Wonder Woman herself was not the only victim of terrible romantic plots and out-of-the-blue weddings during this age in comics, as even the likes of Batman and Superman fell victim to many issues like this. At the end of the ridiculous Silver Age came the Bronze Age of comics, the first attempts to bring realism and adult issues to superhero comic books. Characters saw tremendous growth and new interesting storylines that broke the previous status quo the comic code dictated them to stick to, with these storyline revamps making DC heroes more vulnerable to physical danger, and they began to interact with current events more. For Wonder Woman, this brought the controversial mod era from 1968 to 1973. The Amazons left Earth to recharge their powers in another dimension. Diana gave up her power so that she could remain on Earth. Steve Trevor was killed by the forces of the new villain, Dr. Cyber. Diana learned martial arts from I Ching, a blind man who became her main crime-fighting companion, and with her previous weakness of losing her powers when tied up no longer being a concern, Diana defeated her foes with martial arts, ancient weapons, spy gadgets, and plain old cunning. Despite the loss of her love, Diana was very happy with her life throughout most of the mod era, named because Diana opened a mod boutique and became a successful small business owner who wasn't overly concerned with romance or secret identities. She travelled the world having James Bond-esque adventures. She helped refugees escape communist China. She saved Hong Kong from artificial earthquakes. She went undercover as a hippie, protected a Daldonian princess by impersonating her. She saved President Nixon from an assassination attempt, and she fought cultists in Tibet. More traditional fantasy-based Wonder Woman plots didn't disappear entirely, as Diana found time to visit other worlds, fighting massive battles, and even briefly became a gladiator. To this day, the period's reputation is often low, especially compared to other Wonder Woman runs. Denny O'Neil and Mike Sekowsky wrote highly unorthodox Wonder Woman stories that put off some readers by having Diana operate without her powers, her costume, the support of her people, or a boyfriend. But despite this, they served as a great break of Wonder Woman's previous stagnation and helped her develop as a character, a great image for young female readers as she continued being an independent, compassionate, strong woman. Except in issue 203, where all the progress this era was bringing kind of gets undercut. While they were arguably well-intentioned, the self-titled Women's Lib specials in the first volume of Wonder Woman contained storylines that seemed to require a profound lack of awareness of the character herself, or otherwise took a profound joy in making Wonder Woman seem like she'd taken up getting memory loss as a hobby. The wildest of these exist in this moral blind spot issue, where Diana is offered a modelling job from a wealthy fashion designer. However, her friends later inform her that said designer is paying all the women he's hired below minimum wage using various loopholes in the legal system. Instead of agreeing with her friends and either talking about this with her new boss or quitting, Diana instead drops the biggest bombshell in comics, claiming that in most cases, I don't even like women. It's such a wild statement to come from Wonder Woman of all people that the writer clearly realises that it needed to be quickly glossed over, meaning that an astounding 2 pages later Diana is sobbing and saying that she is realising she is wrong because she is a woman and therefore cannot hate women, but the damage is already done. Coming out of the mod era, Wonder Woman finally regained her powers and returned to adventures reminiscent of her old stories. Throughout issues 212 to 222 came the 12 Labours story arc. In the story, Wonder Woman wants back into the Justice League after a recent bout of amnesia caused her to forget the entire mod era in which she resigned from the League after losing her powers. In order to prove to herself she's eligible to join after the gaps in her memories have made her doubtful of her own abilities, she has to perform 12 labours echoing those of the Greek hero Hercules. What's weird is Diana forcing herself to prove to the other Leaguers that she's worthy to be on the team, nonetheless in such a complex fashion, given each labour is overseen by a different member of the team. So it's hard to imagine someone Diana's character and power needing to jump so many hurdles when it wasn't necessary for others. Several other members of the Justice League have quit or been fired and then rejoined without such tribulations, such as when Batman in the famous Tower of Babel storyline written by Mark Waid for the 1997 revival of the JLA, was fired from the Justice League after a supervillain obtained his secret files containing plans on how to take down each member of the Justice League, and then was welcomed back 3 issues later simply by revealing his identity to them. Congratulations, Batman. Now where are the other 11 labours you performed to prove yourself? Even in the modern day, Diana finds herself getting reduced in role and subject to women's stereotypes she was supposed to break, such as settling down and becoming a housewife after getting married to the milkman. No, I mean an actual milk carton man. There are very few comics in the world that you can say are genuinely, entirely, and purposefully batshit weird, and the crossover comic between Shade the Changeling Girl and Wonder Woman is the epitome of this type of comics, as it contains the kind of wall-to-wall lunacy that makes you almost contact high just from reading it. Put simply, it follows a universe in which Wonder Woman has been put under mind control to believe she is Wonder Wife, a domestic goddess who is creepily obsessed with milk, which appears to be hypnotising her the more she drinks, and fights to enforce women control and adhere to singular emotions so that they remain in their place in the home. How creepy, you say? Well, she breastfeeds a handheld vacuum and marries a milk carton, so it's not exactly an understated kind of thing. Indeed, the milk obsession is perhaps the most normal part of the whole comic, as it appears to have an explanation, unlike literally everything else. Like the constant theme of women's emotions. Wonder Wife even leads a women's rally in which the women are forced to experience only a singular emotion at a time, those being the uglier emotions, like fear and anger, to let it all out so they can remain happy doting housewives. There's very little explanation as to why this hypnotic world the two are trapped in is so focused on reducing women's role, or milk for that matter. And given this is one in a large crossover event, the answers aren't going to be found here, making this issue stand out for the worst. In the end though, whilst there are countless moments like these that seem to be the complete opposite of what we interpret Wonder Woman is supposed to stand for and what story she's supposed to tell, they are often washed over for the better by the larger number of stories in which the focus remains on what and who Wonder Woman really is. We can call her the ultimate hero of the female gender and the testament of female power in comics, but I think we should keep these story arcs and moments in mind so that we know her reputation, like anyone's, isn't perfect. Here is a list of my references, and I hope you've enjoyed.